Hello and welcome. I'm Patrick Curtis, your host and chief monkey, and this is the Wall Street Oasis Podcast. Join me as I talk to some of the community's most successful and inspirational members to gain valuable insight into different career paths and life in general. Let's get to it. In this episode, Emily shares her path from a non-target school to landing a summer internship at Goldman Sachs, what she did when she didn't get the return offer in 2008, and a detailed dive into the day-to-day of analysts in the fund advisory group at Lazard. Learn how that group and working as a placement agent is different from investment banking, and why a transition to investor relations in private equity is a natural next step. Also, don't miss some important advice on the one thing you should believe in before taking on significant career risk. Enjoy. All right, Emily, thanks so much for joining the Wall Street Oasis podcast.
It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
So it'd be great if you could give the listeners just a short summary of your bio.
Sure. So I graduated from college in 2008, and I did my summer internship between my junior and senior year in banking at Goldman in the industrials group. Then upon graduating, I went to Lazard and their private fund advisory group, which does fundraising for third-party private equity firms. And then I've now been at Searchlight for 7.5 years, which is hard to believe, but here I'm head of investor relations and also chief of staff for the firm. So do a variety of different things here.
7 years is a good run. That's very impressive.
Yeah.
So you're graduating in probably the worst year in the last, quarter, century or so, or since the Great Depression. So tell me, 2008, you have this summer internship at Goldman. Do you get the return offer, or was it something like really tough in the summer? Was it super competitive and they just didn't give a lot of return offers?
Yeah, so it was a great experience for me. I did not receive a return offer, which I think that was tough for me. But I felt like as I was going through the process, going through my internship, there were elements of it that I really enjoyed, and then there were other elements of it that it was clear to me weren't really my core skill set. And so from that, did a lot of reflection.
Can we go back even before? So let's talk about how you even landed the internship in the first place. Was that like sophomore, junior year? When did you hear about investment banking? What even made you think, hey, this might be interesting?
Yeah, so I, was doing a lot of networking. I'm not someone who grew up knowing a lot about finance, investment banking, what that really even was, but doing some networking, trying to figure out what it was that I wanted to do with my career. And actually my sophomore year, I saw there was an internship posting at Goldman in some sort of compliance group, and it was not all that exciting, but I knew that it was obviously a great place to work, and a really prestigious role to get in any way you could get your foot in the door there. And so interviewed. I didn't get an internship because at that time they really didn't have a lot of sophomore year interns. But then when I came back, junior year, and when it was really time to get the internship that I felt like really mattered for me, I think they had already seen my resume once. And I was able to, at that point, then really articulate why it was that I was interested in that role. Also, some of my coursework, even though it wasn't very finance oriented. I was an economics major undergrad, also a double major in environmental studies, but I had some areas in coursework that I'd done that I think demonstrated also the sector interest in industrials. And I think that helped. And I also, interestingly, interviewed early because I was going abroad my junior year spring.
Okay.
So I interviewed really early, which now is like really late, right? Yeah. At that time it was really early. And so I was part of kind of an early decision process, which I think helped me overall, probably.
Okay. So did you feel like in terms of interviewing really early and going abroad, and well, you said you applied for sophomore and it was a compliance, you didn't get that, but then all of a sudden you landed a front office industrial? So I kept trying to network with people and understand more about it. Tell me a little bit more about that. Like when you say network with people, or is it like through on campus? Like, I think it's a very small school. Like you went
That's
to a
right.
really small liberal arts school. So was there anything on campus? Is that how you were doing it? Or were you using LinkedIn at
No,
that
there was
point?
nothing on campus. And so I was networking through people, through alumni, through, various personal relationships and kind of any way that I could find in.
Yep.
And so talking to a lot of different people. And even though, many of those didn't lead anywhere, they were super helpful just in terms of honing my message and my ability to talk to people about what I was interested in, and really helping kind of craft that narrative was really helpful. And so spoke to a ton of people to try and figure that out, and was fortunate to, find a connection and a way in to get in for that interview. And I think, even though I certainly didn't come across as, all that knowledgeable around finance, I came across as, I think, passionate about wanting to do a good job and work really hard, and, wanting to be successful.
Was your GPA like really high too, I assume?
No.
No? Wow, you're good at networking.
No, it wasn't.
So your GPA wasn't great. You get somehow from pretty much a non-target, end up at Goldman. Do you think, like you said, the early recruiting, that's interesting to me. The fact that you were going away, you had enough of an in the sense where like you knew, was there one specific person there that was like pushed you through to get that first round interview? That kind of was the key.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. So I think once I got my foot in the door.
But where did you meet that person? Was that just through a friend?
Yeah, through a relationship, someone that helped put me in touch with someone there.
Okay. And then you made a decent impression on him or her such that they helped push your resume into that.
Yeah. And again, I think a lot of it came back to, I think that, interviewing in a way that it demonstrated that I was someone that people could depend on, and that I could, was really like, would kind of have the grit factor and would like work really hard and do a good job.
You were likable. And like, oh, she's not going to leave us out to dry. She's going to work hard, work long hours. Did you communicate that in the interview? Like saying, I know what this job is really tough and it's long hours. Did you say stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like ancient history, but yeah, I'm sure I did.
12 years ago. Come on.
Yeah. But yes, I'm sure that I did, like, very, and look, I'm like, I asked for it, right? It was like, I want this. This is where I want to be. Here's all the reasons I know that. And I was.
And so how did you prepare? You just from all the networking conversations you had, you felt like you understood what the job was about so that you could go in, you kind of talk the talk, you get there. What's the reality versus like what you heard about and then actually living it? Was it like 80-hour weeks, 70-hour weeks? Were you?
I mean, it was really intense. Like, I have to think that 2007, like, investment banking in that environment was pretty up there in terms of intensity. So yeah, I mean, I went in and it was tough. But I feel like, for me, I think the interesting thing was coming into that. I also, didn't grow up in New York, hadn't really spent time in New York before. I think I came into a situation where there was a lot of people who, had been in undergraduate business programs who were just running circles around me in terms of their technical abilities.
Right.
And so that was, and a lot of people who like knew each other, or because of the schools that they went to, knew people in the group. And like, I didn't know like I had to figure out how to like ride the subway to get to the office. Right? Like that was a challenge, So,
where were you from?
I grew up on the Eastern Shore of Maryland.
Okay, cool.
And so I kind of showed up, and it was, I just had to put all that stuff aside and focus on me and focus on doing a good job and doing the things that I knew how to do and like doing the task at hand.
So was it something where like halfway through the summer you knew like, this is no way, this is for me? Was it something like you felt like you just had a slow start because you didn't have that undergrad finance background? And like, I had the same issue. I was a Williams grad. I didn't have even a summer internship. I got into Rothschild, and it was just like, like finance, accounting, everything. And then like modeling, I'm like, what do you mean build this? What do you mean do this model? And I remember it wasn't until my VP kind of took me under his wing, was like, look, this is what you have to do. And I was like, okay. Right. I was working 80 to 100 hours a week consistently.
I was all out.
So my question is like, do you feel like it was the timing, like was the offer rate really high where you one of only a few that didn't get an offer? Or was it the fact that at the timing it was like, oh wait, they knew things were kind of heading south, that they didn't give a lot of offers back, or what, or just you didn't measure?
Yeah, I mean, I think they gave a decent number back. I think there was a handful of people that didn't, that weren't coming back. But I think for me, I think it was, I never raised my hand and said, I don't want this, but I think it was clear to me, partway through that that I should really focus on the things that I was good at. And that, there were elements of the job that I consistently was told, like, you are, like in terms of dealing with the management teams that, of the companies we were representing, or, dealing with various clients, people were like, we trust you endlessly on that stuff. Like in terms of like managing the process and the people and not letting anything fall through the cracks. Like,
it sounds like you would have been better as an associate.
Right. No, and that's exactly the feedback that I got at the time, was like, long term, you're going to be great, but like figuring out the next couple of years in terms of the technicals, there's just going to be a steeper learning curve. And I was up for that learning curve. The math wasn't like intimidating to me, but I didn't find that was what I was really drawn to. Like,
you didn't want to live in Excel for 2 years straight.
That just wasn't what was appealing to me. And okay. I wasn't like, and look, I'm still not interested in like what the stock market is doing and all those things. Like, it's just not as,
okay.
That wasn't my personal interest area. And
was it a surprise, like that summer? What was the most surprising thing? Was the fact that it was so technical and like you were struggling in terms of like the modeling or the technical side? Because I could see, I mean, it makes sense because you're an IR now, and like you're very like good with communications and people, and you're probably a great writer. Was it something along the lines of the technical stuff was just like harder than you thought it would be, or is just more?
No, I think I came in with a very open mind, not expecting that there was any specific, I didn't have an exact expectation of what it would be like.
Yeah.
But I think coming in, I think once I was inside, it helped me realize what I did and didn't like doing, I think is how I put it.
So what didn't you like doing? The modeling or the?
Yeah, I just wasn't interested in that stuff. I wasn't living for the kind of like thinking about the deals that we were doing and the kind of more technical aspects of it.
Okay. So tell me what your thought process was when did you know that or had a good idea that you weren't going to get an offer? Did you not know till the end of the summer, middle of the summer?
And it was at the end of the summer.
And then what was your thought process? Was like, oh no, like what am I going to do going into my senior year? Was it your senior year? Yeah.
Yes, going to my senior year. Yeah, it was, it was a question of, okay, like, where do I go from here? Because that was a fantastic experience. I'm like thrilled that I did it. Learned a lot, but it's not, I don't think that I want to go out and interview for, banking roles. So, what elements of the job did I like, and how can I double down on those more? And then this came back to the kind of the networking and trying to understand, what areas within finance more broadly would give me that same type of, I enjoyed the intensity of it. Like I enjoyed, people who are really passionate about what they were doing, who were really smart and driven, and getting to work with those people. I liked that. But I didn't see myself as being, wanting to follow that path to be a potentially like a private equity investor one day or something like that. That's just not the direction I saw myself going in.
Was there a specific reason, like it just didn't interest you? Like what interested you more? When you say what I liked and what I didn't like, do you like?
I think it was more just that I felt like I was good at and I got feedback that I was good at certain things. And look, when you're good at something and you get feedback that you're good, it feels better than being bad at something.
Like, you mean like presentations, communicating with management and that type of stuff?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think in particular, it was the communicating with senior management. And like, I remember like during the internship, they would like send me to go travel to different places and help with, like tours of these coal mines and things like that. And like, they knew that I could go do that and do a great job of that. And that I really enjoyed, having that, that relationship with the clients. And so that was
cool.
Something that I felt like I wanted to do more of that kind of thing.
And so tell me, as you got back to campus, you'd already kind of had a pretty strong network because you'd been putting in the groundwork. Over at least a year, right? Or a year plus. And so was it somebody that you had already been in touch with at Lazard? Did somebody from Goldman kind of put you in touch with the person who helped you kind of get your foot in there? And then what was the story because I think a lot of people who don't get an offer, they feel like life is over.
Right.
And so I think it's important.
I did feel a little bit like that right at the time.
It's a letdown because you work so hard to get in. And then it's like, for whatever reason, whether it's a down year, whether it's the economy, whether it's just the group didn't feel like you didn't mesh with the group culturally or whatever, you don't get the offer. And all of a sudden it makes, if you do want to be in banking, it makes it incredibly difficult to get another offer somewhere else because you have to tell some sort of story of why they didn't want you. But you kind of took a different stance. You said, well, this might not be for me, but I do like finance. I do like the intensity. So let me see if I can go somewhere else. So tell me kind of how you thought about that, or how you even knew what this private fund advisory.
Yeah, again, I mean, someone suggested it to me, and they said, if that's your skill set, you should probably be in some sort of thinking about a marketing type role. You can either go in the kind of the public route or the private route, and then from there, I thought that made sense. And so then started reaching out to various, public and private sort of marketing type groups and roles.
So can you tell me like what the private fund advisory group is? Like what within Lazard, what did that group do, or what was the job?
Yeah, so they're a placement agent, so that's what people would refer to them as, and that's kind of the broad industry. And so, most all of the big banks have placement agent groups within them. There's also a lot of other, boutique independent placement agents, and what they do is they help private equity firms and real estate and infrastructure firms and credit firms like raise money. Those just call private equity firms generally, they need to go out and raise money every few years or more frequently. And so, a lot of times they have in-house people like myself. And it used to be, 10 years ago, most firms didn't have as many in-house people. And so they relied more on outside placement agents to go out and help them raise money.
There's some independent placement agents, right, that are pretty large, correct? That like specialize in only in this. And I didn't realize that individual banks also have arms. So like at Lazard, can you give us a sense of how big that team is? Is it like 5 people? Is it 20, 100?
No, I mean, when I was there, it was 30 people. I think it's now like 70 people or something.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So it's pretty big.
So UBS, Credit Suisse, like all the big banks have those groups, and they're all large and
I told you I didn't know anything about this space. That's good.
That's good. And so, those groups all have big people, and they hire analyst classes, and and it's hard for them too to find people because people don't know about those.
So what do they call? So private fund advisory, placement agents. What other kind of ways is it named?
That's the main. I mean, that's the.
So if you do like a LinkedIn search, private fund advisory is a decent way to potentially find people who are in that group.
That's right, or placement agent. Yeah, either one.
Okay, that's right. And then, do you think it's better to start in a bank at a placement, and maybe you're biased, but in a division of a bank as a placement agent, or to go to a specific shop that only does placement, is just a placement agency?
I think the experience is probably pretty similar, because I think within a big bank, the placement agent groups are usually pretty separate, because their mandates are just different, and there's not a lot. Like I think in some of the banks they're very separate, and some banks are a little bit more integrated with the bank. But for the most part, it's quite a separate experience. And you'd find that the people in the placement agent group, certainly at the junior levels, don't know a lot of people outside of their group usually. So I think that the overall experience is probably pretty similar. For someone coming in as a junior person at a boutique placement agent that's independent versus one that's within a bank.
Got it. So in banking, you're brought in as a junior person. You're kind of put on these deal teams. You're flown to the client. You're doing pitches. You're working on live deals, potentially if you're doing acquisitions, if you're an M&A, or doing some sort of analysis for clients. Within the private fund advisory group within a bank, how should I think about it? You're brought in. Are you
similar? The structure is very similar, except for instead of getting staffed on a deal that takes a couple months, you're usually getting staffed on a fundraising that's going to take a year or longer. Depending on, hopefully shorter. But it's the assignments with clients tend to be longer, which I enjoyed because then you end up going deeper with those clients. I think also one thing that was helpful in terms of my pivot from banking into the fundraising was that while I was in banking, I worked on an IPO, and we did a lot of S1 drafting, and I think that whole process is very similar to the private placement memorandum drafting in private equity. And so I was able to talk about that process and my contribution to it, why I liked it, really getting to understand, the company and, how we were presenting it. And it's very similar in terms of, on the placement agent side. So that just thinking back to it, that was actually a useful thing that I talked a lot about in the interview process of why I thought I would like the job of being a placement agent.
That makes a ton of sense. Yeah. So the S1 is the document, just for the listeners, that is prepped for the IPO right before our initial public offering, right?
Yeah.
That has to be released publicly and tells all the risks associated with the business and the upside and all that good stuff. So, and then PPM, private placement memorandum, how it is. Is that at a fund level? Are you guys trying to kind of find LPs that'll give money, or is it just for private individuals, high net worth?
That's the document that when you're preparing to go to market for a fund, that's kind of the document that summarizes all those legal risks and all that stuff, but also, articulates the story of why it's a compelling fund that an investor should invest in.
So like the special sauce, so to speak, of the specific strategy or fund. Now, I'm curious, for something that's like proprietary, I guess they're confidential memorandums, but is there something like a, did you ever work on like a quantitative fund that like didn't want to give their secrets away, and they didn't want to put everything in the PPM, and like they just had to show the track record? And
so people include various levels of detail in a private placement memorandum, and sometimes they're very detailed, and then sometimes they're a little bit less detailed. But in private equity, the memorandums are very much confidential, and people have different ways of ensuring that those things are kept confidential. And so, investors, when they see that and other materials for a fundraising, like they expect those to be quite detailed and explain what the fund does. Like if your returns, alone speak for themselves, then, that helps you in terms of not maybe needing to prepare as much, but that's not really how it works in private equity. There's people are used to putting together a lot of materials, and limited partners are used to seeing a lot of materials because they're giving you money that's typically locked up for 10 years.
So you were there for a good amount of time, almost 4 years or over 4 years. Right. So can you tell me how, what your day-to-day was like when you first started and how it progressed? I assume you got promoted or started taking on more of a management role versus the beginning. You were doing a lot of the kind of collection and prep. Document prep. So the way it works at a placement agent is there's typically kind of two main roles within a placement agent. So, when you're out marketing, those are the people that are out having relationships with clients and taking kind of products to them and trying to pitch them and sell them on product. When you come into a placement agent as a junior person, your role is usually on the project management side. And so that's why it's what you described earlier on the kind of banking process being very similar to the placement agent junior kind of process. And so, that role is, drafting materials for the fundraise. So the private placement memorandum, the due diligence questionnaire, which is all the questions that people usually ask, and putting that together, all of the cash flows on the fund, their track record, all their track record information, how you break that down. And then, working on the fundraising program in terms of deciding, we have, support from existing investors. We don't, here's how attractive we think it will be. Here's how, what size target we should set the fundraising, expectations, how much money you can really raise. Where do we think this will be attractive? U.S. corporate pension funds or Asian sovereign wealth funds? How do we think about that mix? And really helping develop all of that in conjunction, certainly with the sales team. But the project management team, makes sure that, you're moving through that process in an orderly way. Everyone's coordinated, working, trying to determine which investors are interested, trying to get that group of investors together to come to a closing to actually. So as an analyst though, or is it called an analyst when you first come in?
Yeah.
So as an analyst, and is there an associate and a VP? How should I think of the layout?
Yeah, the structure is pretty similar to, how you would think about a banking structure, in terms of that, associate, analyst, associate, VP. But it just depends on the deal team, and but you certainly are going to expect to have an MD, a senior person who's steering that fundraising strategy.
And those MDs and those senior people, their relationships aren't necessarily to companies, but more to LPs that are looking to place money.
Well, so there's project management MDs who I would have reported up into, and then there are distribution MDs who are out there with the relationships, and so it's the two sides of the business that work together. So
that's cool. Okay, that makes sense. So there's one like managing director kind of helping get everything together. It's almost like the internal team, the workhorse team to like execute.
Yeah, I think of it being kind of like the nerve center of the fundraising, right? In that project management role, where you're communicating with the PE fund, the general partner, in terms of how things are going. You're having update calls with them, keeping them updated on good news and bad news. What we need from them. Okay, the story is resonating. It's not resonating. How can we adapt that? And then also communicating all that back and forth to the distribution team and saying, okay, great news. They've just exited this business at a great multiple. Like, go back out to your investors and tell them that it helps bolster the story, and kind of managing all of that process. That
makes a lot of sense. Okay, so it's funny because I did a little bit of, when I was at Tailwind, I did a little bit of the help with the fundraising on Fund 2 there. So I know a little bit of that. I was doing the returns and sending out stuff to LP. Yeah, so I lived a little bit of it. But it wasn't it wasn't, all of what I was doing. So you were there for a good 4 years. What do you feel like, or when do you feel like it was time to move on in terms of, were you looking for a new challenge? Was it something of like, hey, I've learned a lot here, but I'm not learning as fast? Or did you just get approached by a recruiter? What was that whole, I guess, evolution from, hey, maybe it's time to move on to when you actually jumped to Searchlight?
Yeah, so I wasn't actively looking to leave. I was just kind of head down doing my job, like super, super busy. It was having been through the kind of 2008, 9, 10, like it was a time when, things were leanly staffed. I was super busy.
Can we talk about pay, or at least range of pay? You don't have to give me exact, but like just an idea of what, I assume it's a little bit less than your front office counterpart, the investment banking, but is it like significantly less? Like the bonus, is the salary, is the base the same?
Yeah, so I think it varies a lot place to place. And I think you'd see it be, coming in, I think that first year, I don't know anymore, and kind of what, I think when I started, it was roughly the same your first year or two. And then, probably, diverged over time. But yeah, it's, it's the pay is a little bit less.
Like 75 base back then, it was probably like 70 or 75 base, and then like a 20K bonus or a 10K bonus, or was it like 40 or 50? Do you remember?
I don't remember exactly.
Okay.
But I think, it was pretty competitive with banking, like those first couple of years, certainly. And like, I think
maybe a slight haircut, but not that dramatic.
Right. No, it wasn't that dramatic.
Because you were putting in, were you putting in long hours still?
Yes. Very long hours. Yeah. It was very intense. Because also I think
80 hours a week or more.
Yeah, I mean, definitely 80 hours a week, sometimes more. I think it was also the other thing too that's a little bit different is that, placement agent role, and I think you and I are to an extent, it's a bit more of a marathon rather than, these sprints, right? So I think like I remember because I went through banking training at Lazard, and I had friends in banking that, they'd be super busy and totally crushed for, however, like a month. And then they would kind of have like nothing to do, for like
some. Still have to be in the office till like 2 a.m.
Right? And they'd be hanging around and be like, what are you doing? Whereas I was just kind of like always like, it was like always the grind, right? There's always, because you've got the client, you always need to be just like moving forward on that fundraising. And so I think that was, that cadence is probably a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So was it more like steady work from 9 a.m. to like 9 p.m. kind of thing, like Monday through Saturday? I think
it would also just depend on the client and where they were in the fundraising, and also
how many were you put on at a time? 2, 3?
No, I was probably like 5 or 6 at a time.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But they're all at different stages. So, some are just like in the ramp up and really getting going, and then others aren't. And some are easier and some are harder, right? Depending on how strong stories. And then also some clients are just very different,
I didn't know we were going to go into the depth of placement agency analyst days. To me, it's interesting because there's not a lot on it on Wall Street.
No, I think it is. And look, I remember when I was trying to get into it, there wasn't much, and I still don't think there's much out there on it. So, but it also just depends on the types of clients you have. Some want to know every single detail and are on top of you constantly, and they want every update right away. And then others like just trust that you're going to do a good job and to want to check in on their weekly call once a week.
So be honest, are the ones that are kind of, I'll call them more pain in the ass clients, the ones that are struggling to fundraise, and so they're now micromanaging every aspect, and the ones that are, the money's coming in and they know they're going to hit their target, they're more laid back about it?
Yeah, I mean, like when things aren't going well, people tend to want more detail on why that is. And of course, like fundraising in 2008, 9, 10, 11 was tough. Like it was a really tough fundraising environment. So
you had a lot of bad news to give?
Yeah, a lot of bad news. Like definitely a time when it was, having to tell GPs a lot that, nobody loved their fund. So, but, things got done. It just took a long time. But, it was all about the communication and letting them know why we were doing what we were doing, and the pacing and staging and convincing people to be patient. And
I can assume that at junior level, you're insulated a little bit from that, but did you see the stress at the senior levels during those years because it was hard to get, because obviously they're probably you're paid as a percentage of the fundraise, right? Typically.
Right, so placement agents do get paid as the standard structure is that it's paid on a percentage of the fundraise, and that can be structured on a variety of different metrics, but it's usually kind of new money. So you don't typically, think of it as the money that the agent raises, because also you always have existing investors and existing relationships. But yeah, that's you get paid to raise money, right? You don't get paid just to sign up to try and raise money. It's very success based. And it depended on the client too. Like sometimes the clients want to go directly to the person at the analyst or the associate level because they know that they're kind of in the flow of all the details all the time. Mm-hmm. It just depends on kind of who you're working with.
Okay. So you're there for a while, you're not really looking, then what happens?
Yeah. So, I'd been thinking about, over time, kind of where do I see my career? And I did like the idea of transitioning into being more outward facing with investors. I wasn't quite ready to make the switch and just be a pure salesperson. I didn't think that, at the time I didn't know that I would enjoy that. So I was, the only thing that would have I wouldn't have gone to another agent. But the natural next step from being at a placement agent is going to, a private equity kind of investor relations role, the same way banking is to a private equity associate role, placement agent is to, fundraising associate role at a private equity firm. So that is the most common next step after, a placement agent role. Yep. And so, I was kind of, open to ideas, but definitely not looking. And someone reached out to me and knew about, someone that was looking for someone. And then they ultimately ended up introducing me to Searchlight. And, it was a pretty attractive proposition to come here. But it was also, they just raised their first fund. So today, we have $7 billion in assets under management and 75 people at the firm. When I joined here, it was not so obvious that, it was going to be a success. Like we'd raised the first fund, but, I felt like I was at a place.
How big was that first fund?
860 million.
Oh, pretty big.
Yeah. So it's a sizable first fund.
Yeah. So it had been de-risked significantly, but still not to the point where you thought.
Right. When you think about kind of long-term over your career, right, it's not like you don't come into private equity because you want to be somewhere for a couple of years. Yeah. It's like ideally you want to be, I think ideally you should want to be there for the long term. And so, that I felt like I was at a place in my career where I could do that, and that I thought I was equipped to be successful at the job, which I think is really important. I felt like, I was stepping into something that I thought I was capable of doing, even though it was definitely a challenge because I hadn't been out in front of investors before. And that was something that was...
Yeah, tell me about the main differences between going from, I assume you were like an associate type role at the, when you were at Lazard at the placement agent group?
That's right. Yeah, I had been promoted to associate. So I 2-year standard, kind of banking type contract. They asked me to stay for a third and then promoted me to associate. So also I felt like, they had treated me well. Like I didn't want, I wasn't like looking to leave. Everything had been good. But felt like this was an interesting opportunity to come in and, to come in and do something.
Tell me about what was the hardest part? What were the biggest differences between the two? I mean, just so I have an idea. I mean, I know very little about investor relations too, so this could be educational. Hopefully I'm not taking up too much of your time, but
no, I could talk. I'm very happy to talk about all this. I think it's interesting.
Yeah, because I think there are people actually, you say, placement agency, the typical exit is to go to IR, but I've also heard there are investment bankers who also are interested in this.
For sure.
And so I'd love to give them a little bit of more of a flavor of like the day-to-day and stuff.
Yes. No, so I think that if you look at people who are successful investor relation professionals today, you'll see a large chunk of those people came from being a placement agent, but just as many came from other things like being investment professionals, being in banking. People do tend to pivot. And I think that's a great experience to have because, being more technical and having that banking training is a great foundation in the long term for an investor relations role. So, I think coming from a placement agent, it's a little easier stepping into an IR role because you kind of know how things work. But having that technical banking background is super helpful. And a lot of people do that.
So what part of the job does that make easier? I mean, is there some technical aspects in terms of like returns and stuff or like?
And just articulating the strategy and the businesses. So it's like when I'm out talking to investors, I need to be explaining to them, why the investments that we make are attractive and how we're transforming them. And, that's something that, it's like if
tell me more about that though. Are you like going out to dinner with like random LPs that are in your fund? Like what is that like every day?
It's not like a glamorous like wining and dining job. Okay. I think maybe it used to be, but that's kind of not the way it works now. People expect you to be really credible and really knowledgeable about your firm, and organized and thoughtful in how you approach them. Be able to answer their questions, whatever those may be. So my role here, and I'll just focus on the investor side of my role because I'm head of investor relations, but then also I am chief of staff for the firm. So I oversee a lot of other kind of HR and kind of firm management type stuff.
Great. Yeah, let's focus on the IR first.
But we'll focus on the IR stuff. So I think, within that role, I'm thinking about a lot of the same things I was thinking about in the placement agent role. It's setting, when are we coming back to market? How much money can we raise? Where will this be attractive? That writing that PPM, the diligence questionnaire, how all of that stuff, comes together to craft the story. The investor presentation is a really important part of that. Track record, returns, how do we present that? All of those things. But then on top of that, I'm also out actually having conversations with investors about the firm. And that's
in what context? Like, how are you even arranging these meetings? Like,
right, so I'm because it's private. I'm reaching out to, the private equity person at various limited partners around the world and trying to get in front of them to
Is
talk
that
to them.
Just like a database that you guys have built over time in your CRM that you personally are making that outreach, or do you have somebody junior below you helping you make that outreach and then you go do the meeting?
It depends on the person. Also I was a team of one here for over
a while.
4 years. So, so I was doing, everything. But typically if I'm going to go meet with someone, I'm reaching out to them. And, but then I have other colleagues now. We have 5 people on the IR team now who are also out, kind of doing all the different aspects of this job. But, when I think about, how do I know who those people are? That's kind of part of the special sauce, in terms of figuring out who the right people are to approach.
Yeah.
You certainly know who all of the big, state pension funds are. It's public information, what they're doing and who they're investing in, and you can find all that information. But what you don't know is what's of interest to them, and what's in their, kind of what are they looking to do. And so
I assume there's a lot of proprietary knowledge that's built up over the 7+ years you've been there in terms of like, okay, this person's looking for this type of thing. They said no this time around, but look,
right. And why did they say no, right? They said no when we raised fund 2 because we hadn't yet realized a bunch of investments in fund 1, but they loved the strategy, right? And so then when we go to raise fund 3, it's like you go back to them and say, hey, look, we've done all the things you wanted us to do. And they say, great, now we're
ready.
Right. So, that's exactly right. And so it's about, getting in front of all of those different, getting in front of the right people and talking to them about.
It's very similar to what you were doing. You're just on the funds. You're just doing it for one fund.
Exactly.
You're kind of more of the face. Are you doing these meetings like face to face? Or are you doing most of it?
Yeah, it's people will do calls, but there's nothing like face to face to be able to judge someone's body language and understand if they're really interested in what you're saying, if they're understanding what you're saying.
Is it hard to get those meetings? And then are you bringing your deck, your pitch for the new fund, out there every time? Is it the same deck, or are you kind of tailoring it for each one?
It depends. I mean, it's mostly the same deck, but the way you talk about it can be different. If someone knows you, sometimes they come and they say, look, I really want to, some people come in and they say, I really want to just focus in on, this investment and, this sector or, this dynamic of the team or whatever.
Why did you guys invest in XYZ? That doesn't make sense. It's not in your wheelhouse, or it doesn't seem like it's, are you
explain to me why this is an investment that you thought was attractive, right? And people will come with their own bias, right? Someone may have a ton of experience in that sector and they may have a ton of knowledge. And then there's other people that you come in and they want to talk about, very high level, thoughts on the firm's investment philosophy at a very high level. So, it can be that every meeting is very different. And now after, having those conversations for so long, I think I've gotten just about every question I could have gotten. But it takes a lot to get there.
Feel like are the people, so your team of 5 now, are the people that are with you in this team, are they doing meetings with you, or are they kind of running parallel to you to try and get bigger, more reach?
It's a mix. So
sometimes they'll bring somebody.
Yeah.
Okay. Just curious. I think it's interesting to hear. So you get into that meeting sometimes, so you have to know a lot about all the specific deals. You definitely have to be super well versed in obviously the overall fund strategy. Speak eloquently about it. Sound like you know what you're talking about, because there's millions of dollars at stake in terms of whether you.
Right. And then, and a lot of times someone from the investment team is in that first meeting. And so they're there as well. So that's also sometimes, sometimes one of our founders is doing most of the talking in that meeting. Okay. But that's up to me on the back end to, answer any of the questions on the, that I may know that I need to answer. But then also be on the back end to follow up and say, hey, we thought that meeting went really well. How do you think about it? We're working toward having a next closing on X date. Is that of interest? Ask the questions that they maybe didn't feel comfortable asking in that meeting or thought about afterwards, or that their colleague asked them that they didn't have the answer to. And then from there, and you build relationships with people. And so, it is a very relationship oriented business. It's a long-term business. So I meet with someone for years and years before they make an investment. And that's just kind of how it goes.
That's fine. Yeah, it's great. I mean, it's a big commitment, right? So I think it sounds really interesting, the role. It sounds like it would be kind of a different side, a little bit more of a marketing hat, a little bit more of somebody who's good public speaking, good with clients. They might enjoy it a little bit more at the junior level, maybe getting even a little more exposure, but a little bit less on the heavy financial modeling and none of that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's the other important thing is that, as I mentioned, we were talking about placement agents and kind of, back in 2008 and 9, the mix between, PE firms having in-house IR people, the number of IR people at your average private equity firm just continues to increase because, private equity fundraising used to be something that, you'd come to market every couple of years, you'd go out, you'd meet with people, you'd raise money, you'd go home, you'd invest it, not really talk to anyone that much for the next couple of years and then come back out again. And now it's, you're always in front of investors, always keeping them updated, and so it's really a year round, every year.
There may be a bigger surge before a big fundraise, but the investors now expect you to kind of be giving them updates.
Right. Yeah.
Why do you think that is? It's just because like people demand more information all the time now, and it's just like
as the industry matures, people are used to, there's more metrics people want to be tracking and keeping in front of, and in terms of fundraising and making sure that you're on people's calendars of knowing when you're coming back, because they only have so much money to spend every year, and they need to prioritize that and make sure that people know that. So I think it's a really great place to be within private equity, and I think that it's a really rewarding, interesting career path within private equity that doesn't have to be,
Are you comfortable sharing just ranges of pay for IR professionals on the big ballpark? It doesn't have to be what you made, but just what you've heard in the street in terms of like base and bonus.
Yeah.
Like how is
so
it?
Here's what I would say. It's a really hard question to answer because, and something that's important, someone thinks about getting into a career in this space. Like, I think that because there are fewer IR people on average at any single fund, there's just less comps in the market, and the role really is different at every firm. So just because there are especially as firms get bigger, like some of the mega funds, they have like 80, 90 people in their placement agent groups. Or in their fundraising groups. And so those roles are very divided, just like they are at...
Because from what I've heard, some of the senior people sometimes are even paid. Like if they're really senior, have an amazing track record and are brought in, I've heard sometimes they can be paid like almost as a percentage of the new dollars they bring in, almost similar to like an outside placement agent. Have you heard of that ever happening?
Yeah. So, that it can kind of work that way. The thing is that the reality is that, as I said, you're kind of always fundraising. And so, it's like in a year where you fundraise, like you'll have more of like a fundraising bonus maybe and get overpaid in that year. But again, that comes down to like every firm has a different philosophy in terms of how they think about that and how they want to incentivize people. So
I assume if they're recruiting from investment banking, the pay has to be at least somewhat comparable to investment banking at the level they're pulling out from.
Yeah, it is a different career path, right? Yeah. So it's like, it's like,
like if a second, for example, let's say a second year analyst says, hey, I don't want to do this investment banking anymore. I'm really interested in investor relations. They interview really well. Their story is excellent. Should they expect a pay cut? And if I would probably say yes, a little bit of a pay cut, but how much, right? Assuming they're at let's say a middle market bank and they're making.
I don't think that if you're coming in as like and this is, I'm sure like everyone would, everyone's gonna have a different opinion on this. But I would think
the range is super wide, but yeah, go ahead.
The range is super wide. But I think if you're coming in as a, first year fundraising associate, I think you'd still be stepping up from what you were getting paid at a bank as a second year analyst, but you wouldn't be stepping up as much as if you were going into an investment professional role.
Like at a PE fund or something.
At a PE fund, right. Like I think on average I think that's probably
so still like it's maybe just not as an accelerated
that's right.
Okay, got it.
That's right. And the curve, it flattens out over time.
That's
and I think that maybe it's over time the top IR professional doesn't get paid as much as a top investment professional, certainly.
Right, because they're not getting care. They're not. Are they? Are you guys?
Typically people would get care, but you're not going to get as much, right? Because you're but it's still going to be a very lucrative career path. Like it's not
getting carry. It can be lucrative if the fund does well.
right. No, it's the pay within investor relations is very attractive, in the scheme of things. But it is a bit of a different dynamic in terms of how much what generally, it's still not like great work-life balance. Like I work super hard. My team works super hard. And I think that's how it is everywhere, but it's
I think that's because
not the pace of an investment professional.
It's not the pace of an investment professional or obviously banking, but do you feel like the reason you work so much is because you kind of have two hats now?
Yes. And also I just I enjoy what I do. And so I push myself to work hard to do that. And
you're handling, you're chief of staff, you said?
That's correct. Yeah.
You're handling all do you have an head of HR as well, or do you?
Not today. No, hopefully we will at some point in the future. But so if anybody is out there who's, interviewing for private equity associate roles, like those come through me here at Searchlight. So, I manage our associate recruiting process principles. I manage.
You gotta be careful if you say that, you're going to get flooded.
I know. Well, that does come for our recruiter. So, I can't do all that, but just in terms of how my role here works, I do. And I think about, all of the different, hires that we're making and how those all fit together. And I think another important thing that I should mention about the investor relations role is that it also gives you an opportunity to really, you mentioned like having that senior exposure, which I think is interesting. But then also, really understanding how the firm works in a way that I think your average investment professional doesn't, and get exposure to a lot of different things. So I oversee all of our PR efforts. I oversee our ESG, environmental social governance investing as part of our diligence process. Actually, I oversee our CRM system and kind of think about, process management around deals, and I'm managing our deal pipeline. So I get to do a lot of different interesting things here, which I really like. And I think my approach here has always been just kind of take on as much as I can. And
you're basically running the fund. You're the top of like the operations almost of like the entire fund.
I mean, like we have a CFO, one of our founders really kind of oversees the kind of the firm operations.
I was going to ask you, the founders, are they like investment professionals? So it sounds like one is a CFO. He's like managing more of the finances.
Well, our CFO is separate. So we have 3 founders who came from Apollo, KKR, and Ontario Teachers.
Okay.
And they are all investors. But one of them, oversees more of the firm operations than the others do. And then our CFO is another person. We have a whole back office of 20 people who do all of that work.
How big is Searchlight in terms of investment professionals? And then
that's about 40 investment professionals.
And then total, how many? 60, 70?
About 75 people.
75. Okay.
Yeah, we have offices in New York, London, and Toronto. So we have a transatlantic platform in terms of how we're structured. So
very cool.
Yeah. So it's been, it's really exciting to.
Well, you're doing lots of different things. It sounds like my day. I'm just like podcast and tell you this and tell you this. It's right. A little crazy, right? So tell me a little bit about the HR thing. Was it kind of like the founders saw you could handle a lot, so they're like, hey, can you handle HR too?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we grew, it became clear that we needed to centralize that a bit more, especially as we were, growing in fund size and thinking about how the firm was growing over time and needing to have one person be the central kind of, funnel point of, how are we hiring people? What does that look like? How many people are we hiring? And also just to have everyone feel like there's a place to come to if there are questions. And, that was the kind of the genesis of it. But yeah, it was something that I'd picked up bits and pieces of along the way. And then ultimately ended up, kind of taking it on more formally. And I think now that we've grown to where we are, I'll transition that to, a new HR person at some point in time, to really take that over, because it's become, that alone has become more than a full-time job.
So question about, can we just reverse a little bit, because I didn't ask you too much about, and then I'll call it, but a little bit about your transition. You talked about how you weren't looking, and the opportunity kind of came with Searchlight through a mutual connection, correct? Mm-hmm. Like just somebody you knew who kind of said, hey, to introduce you. Did you feel like it was an interview, or do you feel like they were just trying to pull you away? Like they had targeted you and they knew? Like was the interview hard? Like did you have to prep for the interview?
Yeah, Searchlight was actually running a search process at the time to hire an IR professional. And the recruiters for that they were working with had not called me. So I was not part of that process. But I knew someone who I actually had previously worked with, who said, hey, you should really think about other opportunities. And it was actually a different opportunity.
Why would the recruiter not call all the people at the placement agents or, private advisory groups at all the top funds? Why do you think they didn't call you? Or were they targeting?
I think it's,
they didn't know you were in that, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's, okay. So, that was, it was.
So, but you heard through.
Probably candidly, I was probably on the younger end of the spectrum of people that they were looking at. But I think the other thing that I should emphasize is that within investor relations, the cultural fit is so important. I think a lot of times what you'd see is the job description may not fit you exactly. And you may, if you're especially that person that's 2 years in banking and thinking about IR, and you see the job descriptions prior, fundraising or placement agent experience required, you can get your foot in the door and you're a really great cultural fit and you have the right kind of core skill set. A lot of times people will be willing to invest in you to kind of train you in that. We did that here with someone that, didn't have any prior experience, had done 2 years in banking, 2 years in private equity, and wanted to get into IR. And so felt and that's been great. So it's much less of a defined process than it is in, banking to an investment professional role, for sure.
Fair. Okay. So anything before we call it, anything else you would tell your younger self now looking back at your long and fruitful career, not too long, but career so far, anything you'd kind of look back either in college or in your first year or maybe 2008 when you were
I mean, I think when I think back on my career, I certainly like stressed out a lot about doing a good job, right? I worked really hard, was always, focused on just doing whatever was asked of me. And I'm really, happy with how everything's turned out. I think that there's always an element of kind of luck in, everyone's careers, right? And ending up in the right place. Like, if I'd ended up, who knows, like, lots of people who graduated in 2008 got fired very quickly, right? For no fault of their own. And I was fortunate to end up in a group, in a place that, was supportive of me and that worked out. And so, it would have been nice if I could have like told my younger self to like maybe relax a little bit more. But I think, that sort of intent.
I have a lot more grades than you do, so don't feel bad. I have like a full on grade beers.
I think also too, just I do have two small kids. And so I have a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old. And so I feel like, I couldn't have imagined that like not that long ago. And so, I just didn't even think about it for a long time. And then, it's kind of amazing now. And I think that, that's such a big, source of pride and joy for me that
I have 3 kids. I have a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 1-year-old. So we're in a similar boat.
Yeah.
Can you just for a second talk to me about how you managed to do that much? I mean, I know you have more support now with the team being a little bit bigger, but are you able to kind of spend time? How do you balance that? Are you working from home ever? Or do you have, I have a nanny.
Yeah.
Do you have a nanny? Like, how are you balancing that? 'Cause I think it's interesting for some people.
Yeah, no, for sure. So, the way I kind of think about it is that, look, I think I've had to improve my efficiency tremendously, right? So for me, it's about really thinking about managing every minute of my day and how I spend that and being super efficient around, all the different things I'm spending time on so that I can try and maximize the time I have with my kids. I have a nanny that's, 8 to 6. And, for me, my husband doesn't travel for his job. I do travel a fair amount for my job. So I think that's, a very good balance is that, one of us is always home in the evening, which is nice. And I think for me, the other thing is that, I really do try and leave at, a time, 5:30, 6 o'clock so that I can get home, do dinner with the kids. They're currently at this stage of life, they're in bed, 7:30, and then I pick back up after that from home. And, I don't kind of tend to work from home during the day. I kind of need to be in the office. I have a lot of meetings, especially with my chief of staff hat. Like there's just a lot of stuff going on that I need to be part of here. Especially having a team of 5 people, right? I need to be here. But I do, try and leave, go home, have dinner, and then in the evening, do what I can from home. Prior to having kids, I was one of those people who was like always in the office super late. I'm a night owl. Like I was always happy to like stay here, later than
you're like, I gotta get out.
Right. But now, now I know I go home and do that and then kind of pick back up afterwards. And then same thing, on the weekends, I try and, really, make sure that I maximize the time with my kids on the weekends.
It's hard. It's really hard. We're in a different, with the third one, I'm telling you, it's a game changer.
No, I've heard that.
We're like, all 3 are sick right now. So it's just like, yeah. Anyways, I'm not sleeping much. I feel like I'm back in my banking days, but.
Yeah. Well, actually, I will say, I think that like going through, a really tough work environment is great training for having kids because people always say like, oh my gosh, it's so exhausting. It's so crazy. It's like, I think just a lot of people haven't never been up at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's like, no, I've been up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning a lot. Like this is, these are hours that I'm used to. So that maybe didn't feel quite so
used to sleep deprivation and pain. So you
right. Exactly. So, but it's wonderful. And, I think that one other thing I thought of that I wanted to touch on is as I thought about my career transition to Searchlight, we talked about some of the kind of career drivers and why I wanted to do that. But the other thing was that, I really believed in the people at the firm and that they would be successful. And so even though there was that element of risk, I thought they were nice people. I thought they were good people who I really respected as investors and felt, confident in them. I think that's so important, especially as people think about going into, kind of a newer, kind of startup, because I think it's attractive to go into a younger firm. But I think that, diligencing those people and, doing whatever you can to find out about them and, knowing that they're kind of good people that you're aligned with around kind of your core values and kind of how you think about life, I just think is really important and something that in hindsight, I feel really fortunate that all that stuff, was kind of worked out. And it's something I certainly thought about at the time, but it's all been true. Yeah. And so just, as people think about taking those career risks, there's your career and what it can do for your career, but also making sure that you just like the people that you're working with, because it's really important you spend a lot of time with them.
Yeah. And that could take patience. I mean, I think I made the mistake of jumping from my investment banking job to a private equity job in Boston, which I thought was my dream job. And I got fired within 6 months. So a lot of people know that story, but we'll say that for another day. But yeah, I agree with you. You got to be patient. You got to do your diligence, make sure that the fund is in good shape, that things are going the right way.
Yeah.
That
really think about the long term, right? Private equity is a very long-term business, and think about that kind of, where do you want to be in 10 or 15 years? And are you and the firm aligned around that?
That's great. Well, Emily, thanks so much for taking the time out of your precious hours. And
I really enjoyed it. It was nice to chat about all these things, and hopefully it's helpful to someone.
Yeah, I think it will be. It's been fun.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much.
And thanks to you, my listeners at Wall Street Oasis. If you have any suggestions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to send them my way, patrick@wallstreetoasis.com. And until next time.